Hello, I am reading about Diocletian at the moment, who was a Roman emperor from around the 290s AD, and he wasn't in Rome very much, but he lived in the east and governed the eastern part of the empire, and he appointed a co-emperor called Maximian who governed the west. And I want to talk about something interesting that I learned about the other day reading. And it's the fact that if you were a private citizen who was getting, who was in court, for example, and had a court case, maybe you're getting prosecuted for committing a crime. And if you think you're being unjustly prosecuted, or if you think the prosecution is using evidence which shouldn't be allowed, you're able to petition the emperor. But because the emperors were moving around so often from their imperial palaces to the frontier to fight wars and visiting different towns, they were never in one place, and you couldn't just go to Rome to their house and give them a letter. You had to work out where they were and then journey to them. You couldn't post it because the postal system was only for the imperial government. So you had to journey there to wherever the emperor was yourself and give it to one of his staff, and then hope that it will be given to the emperor. And then what I find fascinating is that the emperors would write what is called rescripts. So you'd have the letter from the individual, which is often about civil law, or property, or somebody's rights, or freeing slaves, or a legal matter. And then the emperor would just write what he thought about the circumstances underneath. So they acted as judges far removed. They were just going about their business, visiting towns, governing the empire, and whenever they were traveling, they would just write these rescripts, answering questions to these people who were petitioning the emperors. And then how did the private individuals get the rescripts back? They stayed in the same place that they gave it to the emperor, and then it's given back to them, and they can journey back home and use the rescript as evidence because it's written by the emperor and it has their approval. So it can help with law disputes. And I thought that was so interesting because the emperors must have spent so much time doing that, and we have a lot of these rescripts surviving. And the amount of individuals that must have gone and petitioned the emperor, or been upset about something and wanted to ask a question, and then they would just reply. And then later on, we find that there are these two law codes which are published. The first one is the Gregorian Code, and then the second one is the Hermogenean Code. And these are a collection of these different rescripts that the emperors have written, and they are collated all together and then published. And this is presumably so that the emperors don't have to individually write the same answers to similar questions, and then maybe they only write answers to new questions, and people can see this published list of rescripts and understand this is what is right and wrong, or this is how law should work. So I think I'm going to be looking more into these codes as evidence of how the government worked, because I'm reading for my dissertation for my third year, and I want it to be on something surrounding Diocletian's rule and his administration, because he enlarged the government and made it very bureaucratic. He made it so it was a tetrarchy, so there were 4 emperors at once, 2 senior emperors and 2 inferior emperors, and then when the senior emperors died, the younger ones would come up and succeed them. So he changed a lot of how the empire was governed, and I think that was very interesting. He also led a massive persecution of the Christians, which isn't so good. And if I wanted to do it on that, it would have to be like I would have to just focus on the persecution because it's such a big subject. So I think I'm going to go for more other aspects of administration and government. I just think it's amazing how some of these rescripts survive, and how we have edicts as well. Edicts is another thing that they would write, not like a rescript where they would answer a question, but on their own accord they would decide, okay, let's put this into law. For example, the persecution of the Christians, so they made it illegal to worship Christianity, and made it so governors had to persecute them and kill Christians if they found them. And then they published these edicts, and put them on like notice boards in towns. So it also presumed that the majority of the population was literate, which definitely wasn't the case. I know that in the early empire, the literary rates were not more than 10%, I think. So I don't know how they were expecting the lower classes to get word of this. I suppose just through seeing that, oh, those Christians have just been killed over there, or hoping that the upper class will just tell them. But maybe the literacy rates increased in this point, from the early empire to this later point in late antiquity. And an example of an edict is the Edict of Maximal Prices, where there's a long rhetorical preamble where they say, oh, the Emperor Diocletian, and Consul for the 13th time, and Pontifex Maximus for the 17th time, etc., etc., listing all of the titles. And they do that for each emperor, and they say, we emperors have noticed that tax collectors are exploiting the population and keeping the money themselves and not passing it to the government, and that there are problems in prices in the economy, i.e. there were traders who were selling certain items way above what they were supposedly meant to be priced at. So then this edict set a maximal price on lots of different goods, including how much pay somebody should get for a certain profession, which is pretty extreme. So I would say a teacher of rhetor, a rhetor, would get this much denarii per month, or a arithmetic teacher would get this much per month, and a farmer with this much land would get this much. I don't think they said farmer, but they listed lots of professions, lawyers as well. And then they also set the price of different goods like meat and different vegetables and I'm not sure whether they did materials or not. But definitely, I think just common marketplace things that would be sold. And Lactantius, who is a Christian author and is obviously quite negative about the Tetrarchy because of the persecution, tells us that this edict was a disaster because it just made it so that there was even more inflation that there was. And he talks a lot about land requisition, the taking of land and exploiting the people and the overtaxing of the people, because Diocletian also split the empire into dioceses. That's where we get the word diocese, which and there were dioceses in each province. So he split the empire up into many more sections, which helped each section to be taxed further because there were more staff. There was like a staff member for each diocese, which meant there were more across the empire, and it just meant that you would just get taxed the hell out of. But that's only one source, and from a biased source, because he was a Christian writer. But we do have other sources, but it's hard to fit together what actually happened, which is why it's such a fascinating puzzle. It's like a problem that you have to solve. Well, that is all I had to say. I mainly wanted to point out the interesting fact about the rescripts and how the emperors would write back to individuals, and the fact that it wasn't posted. They would write letters to their other emperors as well. It was rare that there's possibly one time when all 4 emperors were together. You'd think that if you're ruling the empire, you'd meet up very often in person to discuss things, but they would just write letters to each other, not necessarily asking for agreement. They would write edicts like the one to persecute the Christians, and then this is what Diocletian did, and his other younger emperor decided, let's start persecution, and then they sent the letters off to the west demanding that the other emperors did it. And one of the emperors, Constantius, supposedly didn't follow through with the orders so well, like as determinately as he could have. So it seems that each emperor did have quite a bit of autonomy in like these rescripts, or not the rescripts, in the edicts that were sent. But I just think it's really interesting trying to figure out how it all worked in such a complex world. Anyway, have a great rest of your day, and goodbye.